Before the city awoke, before the markets opened, before the priests lifted their morning prayers, something happened outside Jerusalem that no one was prepared to explain. A sealed tomb stood in the silence of dawn. Roman soldiers, trained to face blood, war, and death without trembling, collapsed to the ground like dead men. A great stone that had closed a grave was no longer where it had been, and by the time the first grieving followers arrived, the body they had come to honor was gone. But what happened next may be even more astonishing than the empty tomb itself. A woman came weeping, not expecting a miracle, but expecting to mourn. Priests, determined to preserve their authority, began spreading a story before the sun had fully risen. Two disciples ran to a burial place and found details so strange that they could not make sense of what their eyes were seeing. Before the day was over, broken men who had hidden behind locked doors would claim they had stood face to face with the one they had watched die. What truly happened on that Sunday in Jerusalem? Was it confusion, grief, and rumor? Was it theft, fear, and desperate imagination? Or did that day reveal something that would change the course of human history forever? To understand the answer, we must return to that sacred morning and follow the story step by step, from the darkness before dawn to the peace that entered a locked room. The events of that morning took place in Jerusalem during one of the most significant periods in the Jewish calendar, Passover. This annual feast commemorated Israel's deliverance from slavery in Egypt, when God spared his people through the blood of the Lamb. Because of its importance, Jerusalem became the center of intense religious activity during this time. Under normal conditions, the city's population was relatively modest. However, during Passover, thousands of pilgrims traveled from distant regions to worship at the temple. The population could swell several times over, filling the streets, surrounding hills, and temporary shelters with people. The city became crowded, noisy, and filled with anticipation. At the same time, Judea was under Roman rule. Roman authorities maintained strict control, especially during major Jewish festivals when the risk of unrest was high. Crucifixion, a public and severe form of execution, was used to suppress rebellion and maintain order. Just days before this particular Sunday, a man named Jesus of Nazareth had been crucified outside the city walls, a punishment reserved for those considered threats to Roman authority. Jewish burial customs also play an important role in understanding the events. The dead were typically wrapped in linen cloths with aromatic spices and placed in tombs carved out of rock. A large stone would then be rolled in front of the entrance to seal it. Contact with a tomb made a person ceremonially unclean, so care was taken to mark burial sites clearly. Because the crucifixion occurred just before the Sabbath, the burial of Jesus had been hurried. According to the law, the Sabbath was a day of rest, and no work could be done from sunset Friday to sunset Saturday. This particular Sabbath, falling during Passover, was especially solemn. As the city rested in silence, a tension remained in the air. The execution had ended one movement, but it had not erased the memory of the one who had stirred hope among the people just days earlier. At the center of this unfolding story is Jesus of Nazareth, a teacher, healer, and figure who had drawn both devotion and opposition throughout his ministry. In the days leading up to his crucifixion, he had entered Jerusalem to the welcome of crowds. Yet within a week, he was condemned and executed. To many, his death seemed to mark the end of all expectation. Around him were his disciples, a small group of men who had followed him closely. Among them was Peter, one of the most devoted, yet also one who had recently denied even knowing him during the night of his arrest. There was John, who remained near the cross and witnessed the final moments of Jesus' life. The others had scattered in fear, uncertain of what would happen next or whether they themselves might be in danger. Yet there was another group whose role would become unexpectedly significant. Women who had followed Jesus from Galilee. Among them were Mary Magdalene, who had experienced profound personal transformation through him, Mary, the mother of James, Salome, and others who had supported his ministry. Unlike many of the disciples, these women remained present through the crucifixion and carefully observed where his body was laid. Their situation at the beginning of the story was marked by grief, loyalty, and unfinished devotion. The burial of Jesus had been rushed due to the approaching Sabbath, leaving customary preparations incomplete. These women resolved to return to the tomb as soon as they were able, carrying spices to properly honor his body. Meanwhile, the religious leaders who had sought Jesus' execution remained watchful. Concerned that his followers might attempt something unexpected, they had secured the tomb with a seal and stationed guards to prevent interference. Each group stood at a different place, some in fear, some in sorrow, some in control. Yet none of them fully understood that the events about to unfold would change all of their lives. As the Sabbath came to an end and the first light of a new day approached, the city of Jerusalem remained quiet. In that stillness, a group of women made their way toward the tomb. They carried spices prepared with care, intending to complete what had been left unfinished during the hurried burial. Their conversation was simple and practical. They wondered who would move the stone from the entrance. The weight of it made their task seem impossible, yet they continued forward. Their purpose was not driven by expectation of a miracle, but by devotion to one they believed was dead. When they arrived, they were met with something entirely unexpected. The stone had already been rolled away. The tomb, once sealed and guarded, now stood open. The women paused, uncertain, trying to understand what they were seeing. As they entered, they did not find the body they had come to anoint. Instead, they encountered a message that challenged everything they believed had happened. The one they were seeking was no longer there. The reaction was not immediate joy. It was confusion, fear, and astonishment. They had come prepared for death, not for life restored. Mary Magdalene, overwhelmed by what she saw, turned and ran. Her first conclusion was not resurrection, but loss. She went to find Peter and John, saying that the body had been taken and that its location was unknown. Hearing this, the two disciples hurried toward the tomb. They ran side by side, driven by urgency and uncertainty. John reached the tomb first, but stopped at the entrance, looking in. He saw the linen cloths lying there, but hesitated. Peter arrived moments later and entered without pause. Inside, the scene was deeply puzzling. The burial cloths were present, yet the body was gone. The cloth that had covered the head was set apart from the others, arranged separately. Nothing appeared disturbed in the way one would expect if the body had been taken by force. They stood in silence, trying to interpret what they were seeing. It did not match any explanation they could easily accept. Eventually they left, returning to where they had come from, still uncertain of what had taken place. Mary, however, remained behind. Standing outside the tomb, she wept. Her grief had not yet made room for any other possibility. When she looked again into the tomb, she saw figures in white where the body had been laid. Even this did not shift her understanding. Her focus remained on the absence of the one she loved. Turning away, she encountered someone standing nearby. Believing him to be a gardener, she asked if he knew where the body had been taken. It was only when he spoke her name that everything changed. Recognition came not through sight alone, but through a familiar voice. At the same time, in another part of the city, the guards who had witnessed the earlier events reported what had happened to the religious authorities. Faced with a situation they could not easily control, the leaders responded by forming a narrative. They instructed the guards to say that the body had been taken while they slept and offered them protection in return. While this explanation began to circulate, other developments were taking place. Two followers of Jesus were traveling away from Jerusalem toward a nearby village. As they walked, they discussed the recent events, the crucifixion, the reports from the women, and the confusion surrounding the empty tomb. Their tone reflected disappointment. They spoke of hope in the past tense, as something that had already been lost. A stranger joined them along the road. As they walked together, he asked about their conversation. They explained what had happened, expressing both sorrow and uncertainty. The stranger responded by guiding them through the scriptures, helping them see a broader meaning behind the events they had witnessed. Yet they did not recognize him. When they reached their destination, they invited the stranger to stay. As they sat together and shared a meal, something familiar in his actions caused their understanding to shift. In that moment, recognition came, and just as suddenly, he was no longer visible to them. Realizing what had happened, they returned immediately to Jerusalem to share what they had experienced. Meanwhile, the remaining disciples were gathered behind closed doors, still uncertain and fearful. It was there, in that space of uncertainty, that the next stage of the story would unfold. As evening fell over Jerusalem, the city returned to its usual rhythm, unaware of the quiet tension building behind closed doors. Inside a room where the disciples had gathered, fear still lingered. The doors were locked. The windows were shut. Every sound from outside could have been a threat. These were men who had followed Jesus openly just days before. Now they were hiding. The one they had trusted had been crucified, and though rumors of an empty tomb had reached them, uncertainty still overshadowed hope. They did not yet understand what had truly taken place. Then, without warning, everything changed. Jesus stood among them. No door had opened. No footsteps had been heard. Yet there he was, present, visible, unmistakable. The moment was overwhelming. Fear and disbelief rose together, as if their minds struggled to accept what their eyes were seeing. He spoke first. Peace be with you. These were not words of correction or judgment. He did not ask why they had fled or remind them of their failure. Instead, he addressed their fear with peace, a peace that did not depend on their strength or faithfulness. To remove all doubt, he showed them his hands and his side. The marks of crucifixion remained, not as signs of defeat, but as evidence of what had been overcome. This was not a vision or a memory. It was the same Jesus they had known, now standing before them alive. Still struggling to grasp the reality, they watched as he shared in something ordinary, food. In that simple act, the extraordinary became undeniable. In that moment, fear gave way to recognition. Uncertainty began to fade. What had seemed impossible now stood before them as truth. The one who had died was alive, and everything they believed about the end was being rewritten. In the moments that followed, the room that had once been filled with fear began to change. The presence of Jesus brought clarity where there had been confusion and steadiness where there had been uncertainty. He spoke to them again, repeating his words of peace, as if to settle their hearts fully. Then he gave them a new understanding of what had taken place, the suffering they had witnessed, the death they had mourned, and now the reality of his living presence. All of it had purpose. He reminded them that these events were not unexpected, but had been spoken of long before. The scriptures, which they had heard many times, now began to take on new meaning. What once seemed like scattered teachings now formed a complete picture. More than that, he gave them a role in what would come next. As the Father has sent me, I am sending you. The disciples who had hidden were now being entrusted with a mission. They were no longer simply followers trying to understand what had happened. They were witnesses, called to share what they had seen and heard. In a symbolic and powerful act, he breathed on them, speaking of the Spirit that would guide and strengthen them. This moment marked a transition. The fear that had kept them behind locked doors began to give way to purpose. The story did not end in that room, but it was there that everything changed. What began as a day of confusion and grief was now becoming a foundation for something greater, a message that would move beyond Jerusalem and reach far beyond those walls. The events of that day reveal more than a sequence of extraordinary occurrences. They point to a deeper spiritual truth about God's work and his relationship with humanity. Each person encountered Jesus in a different condition. Mary came in grief, unable to see beyond her sorrow. Peter carried the weight of failure. The two travelers walked in confusion, believing their hope had ended. The disciples gathered in fear, uncertain of their future. Yet in every case, Jesus met them where they were. He did not wait for them to understand, nor did he require them to overcome their weakness before coming to them. Instead, his presence brought clarity, peace, and restoration. This reflects a consistent message throughout Scripture, that God reaches toward people even in their moments of doubt, fear, and brokenness. The resurrection also reveals that what appears to be final is not always the end. What seemed like defeat became the turning point of hope. The disciples had interpreted the crucifixion as loss, but through the resurrection, they began to see it as part of a greater purpose. At its heart, this story teaches that faith is not built on perfect understanding, but on encountering the truth of God's work. It invites reflection on how God's presence can transform uncertainty into trust and fear into peace. The story of that day continues to speak into the lives of people today. Just as the first followers of Jesus experienced confusion, fear, and doubt, these same emotions are part of the human experience now. There are moments when circumstances feel uncertain, when hope seems distant, or when past mistakes weigh heavily on the heart. In those moments, this story offers a quiet reminder. Transformation often begins not when everything is understood, but when we remain open to what God may be doing. The disciples did not begin that day with confidence. They began with questions. Yet by the end of the day, their perspective had changed. What made the difference was not their own strength, but the presence of the one who came to them. This invites us to consider how we respond in our own lives. Do we allow fear or doubt to close us off? Or do we remain open to the possibility of renewal and guidance? The message of this story encourages us to trust that even in uncertain moments, there is a greater purpose unfolding, one that invites us to move forward with hope and quiet confidence.